All right, it is 11 a.m., so let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. We've made it through another week. I think we've got 4 more weeks to go after this before Thanksgiving break, and of course, we won't be returning to the classroom after that. We will conclude online like the rest of the university. Today, we're going to conclude our study of Judaism. So we've got our 5th and final lecture on Judaism today. We're going to explore modern Judaism, or Judaism and modernity today, as we've done with some other traditions once we get to a 5th and final lecture. And after the lecture today, you will have an online homework assignment. So this assignment is simply called Judaism Homework, or Judaism HW. You will find it on the Moodle class website. And it's just a set of questions based on our study of Judaism designed to reinforce our knowledge of Judaism before we begin our 5 lectures on Christianity starting on Monday. Okay, so because we have 10 lectures in this section, I wanted to put an extra assignment between Judaism and Christianity to reinforce some of our understandings of Judaism before we jump into another tradition. So that assignment is worth 5 points, and it is due by the start of class on Monday, so 11 a.m. on Monday. Don't forget to do that assignment, and again, it'll go active as soon as I'm done with class today, so 11:50 or so. All right? So in my 4th lecture, we talked about the diaspora. The diaspora refers to the migration of Jews throughout initially the Mediterranean world and other parts of the Middle East, but in time, even further. Of course, when you get to the modern era, we're talking about Jewish migration to countries like the United States of America as well. And because of the dispersal of those Jewish communities to different parts of the world, we can begin to talk about 2 major geographic, cultural Jewish communities. And we focused in on the Ashkenazim, the Ashkenazi Jews being those who settled initially in Central Europe, but that term comes to refer essentially to all the European Jews except for those in Spain and Turkey, those who lived under Christian rule. And then we talked about the Sephardim, that Sephardic Jews initially refers to those who settled in Spain, but then in time comes to refer to those throughout North Africa, going all the way to Egypt. And then, although technically we could refer to Jews living east of Egypt as Mizrahi Jews, we grouped the Mizrahis and the Yemenites in with the Sephardim, so we described all of them as Sephardic Jews, or those who live under Muslim rule once Islam is established after the 7th century. So for today's lecture, we're going to be talking about Ashkenazi Jews. We're going to be learning about the impact that the Enlightenment and the great changes of modernity had on the Jews living in Europe, and how those ideas in turn affect Jews in other parts of the world as well. So we know, as I've discussed several times before this semester, that in the 18th century, we have this revolutionary movement within Western Europe known as the European Enlightenment. And this is a real paradigm shift. It changes the way people think about knowledge, about humanity, about our place in the world, ushers in this new age of reason and science and secularism, the separation of religion from the public sphere, and new ideals of natural rights, which eventually develop into what we call today human rights. And this coincides also with a shift away from empires and emperors and absolute monarchs towards different types of democratic systems, such as our political system here in the United States. The United States is born in the 18th century during the Enlightenment. In Britain, although you have the monarchy continuing, it becomes largely a ceremonial head of state, and the real power of the government is a democratic institution, a parliamentary democracy with a prime minister and so forth. With the dismantling of empires, people begin to think about themselves as part of nations. We have the rise of nationalism, and nationalism is the idea that people who share a common historical experience, at least insofar as they imagine it through narrative, a common language, a common culture, which may include religion, are a distinctive people unto themselves apart from other peoples. And being a distinctive people in the modern era, these nations begin to talk about their desire to have a nation state, a state uniquely for that people, for that nation apart from other peoples. So as we see great empires, like the Ottoman Empire, dismantling, we see the different peoples that once lived within these multi-ethnic, wide-ranging political entities, now creating new nation states. And so when we see the creation of modern nation states like the United States of America, like France as we know it today, like Germany as we know it today, people begin to think of themselves in terms of simply being German or French or Austrian or American. And this idea broadly means that one, if you're German, if you're a citizen of the German nation state or the French nation state, that you are equal regardless as to your opinions on religion, right? That you shouldn't have inferior rights or lose rights because of your religious identity or lack thereof. So amidst this environment, Jewish thinkers are grappling with their place in these new societies, in these new nation states. Should they assimilate and become part of these new nation states instead of thinking themselves as Jews apart from, Gentile Germans or French or other Americans, to adopt the language of the country? So instead of speaking, for example, among the Ashkenazi Jews, instead of speaking Yiddish first, adopt a first language like French, German, English, dress like everyone else, adopt the cultural norms of this society, and just become part of the broader nation state. So some Jews follow that route. Others reject that. They say, no. We have to preserve our identity. We have to continue our traditions. And if that means separating ourselves and living apart, then so be it. And for example, one community that did that was the Hasidim that we learned about last time. The Hasidic communities continue to remain insular and set apart from the rest of mainstream society and maintain their distinctive cultural and religious traditions. Well, those who embraced, who assimilated, who participated in the broader cultural changes going on had access to the latest scientific discoveries, the latest political philosophies, all the latest knowledge, and this sheds new critical light on things like religion. So we have, out of the paradigm shift of the European Enlightenment, the seeds for the emergence of a discipline like my own, the academic study of religion, religious studies, which is separate and distinct from, for example, theology. In my program, I'm not training to be a priest or a minister or a rabbi or an imam. I'm a sort of hybrid sociologist, historian who critically analyzes religion on a global scale. Right? So the seeds of that kind of study of religion are born out of this period in European history. And so this raises questions about the Bible. Who wrote it? When was it written? What about the content of it? Does it match the latest scientific knowledge? If not, why? And so that emerging set of modern knowledge, questions some of the claims of the Bible and the historicity, and this emboldens people in the Jewish community to begin to think about the Bible and their own traditions and practices and beliefs in new ways. For some people, it means abandoning it, but other people, it just means reforming their understanding, seeing Judaism as something that's dynamic, that needs to be reinterpreted in every age. And so out of these debates, out of the influence of the European Enlightenment on Jewish thought, what's called the Haskalah, this is the Jewish Enlightenment, European thinkers from the Jewish community like Moses Mendelssohn, grappling with those ideas. And the result is that we see the emergence of new forms of Judaism. And I want to talk about three major branches of modern Judaism that you are likely to encounter being here in the United States in your own lives. Those three major branches are Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, and Orthodox Judaism. Now, Orthodox Judaism is what we would think of as traditional Judaism, Judaism as it was. But in response to the existence of these new forms, that traditional Judaism now has to self-identify itself as orthodoxy. You don't necessarily need to call yourself Orthodox unless there's something that is different than you. So orthodoxy emerges, and then even within the Orthodox camp, there is a faction that is a little more open to some reform ideas. Still Orthodox, but a little more reformist in thinking. And so there is such thing as modern Orthodox, and then there's the real traditionally Haredi and the Hasidim, who are mystical, right? They are Haredi, but also distinct from non-Hasidic Haredis as well. So I want to tell you about these three branches of modern Judaism, and then we'll move on to some other topics related to modern Judaism. First, we have Reform Judaism. And since I'm the only one in here, I'm going to go ahead and remove my mask, make it a little easier on myself. So Reform Judaism represents the modern form of Judaism that most fully embraced new interpretations, new thinking, new approaches to Jewish tradition. This was the faction of the Ashkenazi Jewish community who really embraced assimilation, of becoming part of the broader society around them, the non-Jewish society around them, adopting that language, the language of the nation state, and even incorporating that into liturgical practices like prayer. And that Jews should be fully involved in all the latest learning. So that means that you don't have a separate Jewish school where you only study like Talmud and things like that. Instead, you fully study all of the latest scientific discoveries, chemistry, biology, evolution, all those types of things, and that is not at all antithetical to Judaism. In order to adapt to the modern way of living, Reform Jews made a number of significant changes. So, for example, at worship services in the synagogue, the vernacular language becomes in use. Vernacular meaning the language spoken by the people. So instead of biblical Hebrew being used in prayers, they could do the prayers in English. So reading English translations, French, German, Polish, whatever it may be. They would adopt prevailing modern types of instrumentation. So for example, we see new instruments like a pipe organ being used in a synagogue now, something that you would have found in churches in Europe at the time. The worship service itself is also shortened, making it easier for people in the hustle and bustle of modern life. Okay, it's 9 o'clock, let's go to shul, we'll go to the service, and then we'll be home by 10:30, so then we can go and do this, all those types of things. Within the synagogue itself, we know that the tradition within a synagogue was that men and women would sit in separate places. But in Reform Judaism, the spirit of new understandings of natural rights and the equality of men and women, albeit this is a slow and gradual process, men and women can now sit together in a synagogue. So you no longer have women in a separate section, a balcony, or behind a screen, a mechitza. Once you get to the latter part of the 20th century, Reform Jews are the first to begin ordaining women as rabbis. The first true ordination of women in the Reform tradition happens in 1972. And so it's very common in Reform synagogues to have female rabbis. Also in the spirit of greater gender equality, the ritual of a bat mitzvah is introduced. So a bar mitzvah is a rite of passage, a coming of age ceremony for Jewish boys who, when they turn 13, they are now recognized as men in terms of halakha, Jewish law. And so once you're officially a man, then you have to follow all the commandments. So you got to do your prayers, and you have to fast, and you have to do all those things once you've reached that age. When you're a little kid, you don't have to do that. And there was a traditional ceremony in which the boy would read a Torah portion for the community and so forth. That didn't exist for girls. But in Reform Judaism, they introduced the bat mitzvah ceremony, which was just like that of boys, but now it's for girls who are coming of age. Now, according to halakha, the rabbis say that a Jewish girl becomes a woman at the age of 12, A Jewish boy becomes a man at the age of 13. But in Reform Judaism, they changed that. They moved the girl's age to 13, the same as a boy, in the spirit of gender equality. How could you go about making all these changes? Aren't you going against the word of God? Well, Reform Jews had a different understanding of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible was still sacred as a repository of Jewish tradition and knowledge and theology, but they accepted modern critical academic analysis and said, okay, well, our sacred text is a book written by people, written by human beings who in their writings reflected their own time and their own circumstances and their own views and attitudes of the world, and that those ideas are not necessarily binding on us living in the 21st century. And so while they will still take, for example, moral principles from the text, a principle like justice, they won't necessarily take a literal verse about something like, let's say, stoning adulterers, right? That doesn't apply anymore. It is obsolete. And so with that sense in mind, the rabbis from the Reform tradition can more readily make changes based on that kind of analysis of the sacred text. And to that end, they believed that it was no longer necessary for modern Jews to observe rules such as dietary law. So it wouldn't be uncommon for Reform Jews not to keep kosher, to eat, for example, a dish that combines meat and dairy, or to prepare those dishes in the same vessels. Those types of traditional restrictions, which you'll still find in Orthodox Judaism, no longer apply in Reform Judaism. The same thing goes with things like purity laws, right? The strict rules about, for example, women going to a mikvah to purify themselves, those things don't apply anymore either. Now, on an individual level, if you are part of a Reform congregation and you find it important for yourself personally in your own devotional life to keep kosher, to visit a mikvah and go through all those things, then you're of course free to do so. But Reform Judaism's official position is not that it's not obligatory upon you. You're not committing a sin by, eating non-kosher food, for example, right? That those things no longer apply. So where did Reform Judaism really grow and prosper? Well, today, the United States of America is the center of Reform Judaism. The preeminent institutions of Reform Judaism are located here in the United States. Reform Judaism makes up the biggest segment of the Jewish community. And I'll show you a chart later where it breaks down people who identify either as non-religious or Orthodox, conservative, Reform, others. Reform is the biggest faction. So this type of progressive liberal Judaism is prominent here in the United States. It is not prominent in the state of Israel, which we'll be learning about later in the lecture today. Their orthodoxy, traditional Judaism, is dominant. So American Judaism has much more progressive liberal thought within it. Here we can see some images reflecting the changes brought about by these reform movements in the modern era. Here we see a girl, now a woman under Jewish law, using a yad and reading from the Sefer Torah, from Torah scrolls. She's reading her Torah portion for her bat mitzvah, right? Being recognized as a woman. Here we see a female rabbi, and she's taking the scrolls from the ark in the Jerusalem-facing wall of the synagogue. So in response to the reformers in the Ashkenazi community, there was a backlash. There were those within the Jewish community who rejected the idea that Judaism needed to be modernized or reformed or changed to adapt to this new period in human history. And that's the faction that we subsequently come to know as Orthodox Judaism. And again, before you have these reform movements, there's no need to call it Orthodox Judaism. It's just Judaism. It's just rabbinic Judaism. But now, to distinguish this traditional form from the reform movement, we call it Orthodox Judaism. So this is the branch of Judaism that defends and preserves the traditional way of doing things. Continues to call for strict adherence to Jewish law, halakha, based on the Talmud and the Tanakh, that the Torah is divine revelation given to Moses, immutable, of divine origin, and thus you need to keep all the various mitzvot, the commandments of the Torah, such as keeping kashrut, right? Continuing to maintain dietary law, particular styles of dress, wearing the kippah, wearing a shadel, all those different things are still important. Rabbis in the Orthodox tradition are exclusively men. Now, there have been some stirrings, some individual efforts to introduce female ordination into Orthodoxy, but it hasn't gained momentum. And so, generally speaking, you do not have female rabbis in the Orthodox tradition. It's still exclusively men. When you visit an Orthodox synagogue, men and women are still separated from each other. You still can continue to see the use of a mechitza, some kind of barrier screen, or separate balconies to keep women apart from the men. Only boys have a bar mitzvah, so the bat mitzvah doesn't become part of Orthodox practice. However, the popularity of bat mitzvahs grew to such an extent that an individual family, even though they're from the Orthodox tradition, may choose to, for their daughter, have a bat mitzvah ceremony, but it's not officially part of Orthodox Judaism. As I mentioned, men and women will still cover their heads, so women in an Orthodox synagogue would still traditionally cover their hair and so forth. And, of course, strict observance of Shabbos, or the Sabbath day. In Reform Judaism, you don't have that. So people might go to synagogue for worship services on the Sabbath in Reform Judaism, but all the regulations that the rabbis laid out about not cooking or not building a fire or tying knots, all these various rules that are laid out in rabbinic law, that's still part of Orthodoxy, but it's not a part of Reform Judaism. And in fact, at one point, some members of the Reform community even toyed with the idea of moving the Jewish Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday in order to assimilate to the prevailing Christian culture around them in Europe. They say, well, the Christians go to church on Sunday, so maybe in the spirit of adapting to the culture around us, we too should have our services on Sunday. That view did not win out in the end. And so in Reform Judaism, the Sabbath is still Saturday, but there were some people who were kind of so zealous to adapt that they even went so far as to talk about moving the Sabbath. Here we can see some images of an Orthodox synagogue where we still have the gender barriers in place. So this is the women's section, apart from the men's section in the front. This is the mechitza. Here we can see a separated balcony with curtains as well. So in this synagogue, the men would sit here. There's the ark in the front, and the women would sit up here. So that's an easy way to tell whether a synagogue is Orthodox or not. Now, we have these two camps. We've got Reform Judaism, the liberal, progressive, modern form of Judaism, and then we've got the defenders of Jewish tradition. That's Orthodox Judaism. Then there emerges another group in the middle, a middle ground between the two, trying to find a balance between these two positions. And that's what's called conservative Judaism. So conservative Judaism actually is not the most conservative. That's Orthodox. Conservative Judaism is the middle ground between the two, and it's smaller than Reform or Orthodoxy. So the founders of conservative Judaism, in spirit, they liked the idea of reform and modernizing, but they felt that Reform Judaism had gone too far. They were too quick to abandon Jewish tradition in order to assimilate and adapt to modern cultures, modern nation states. So these Jews were interested in being a bit more hesitant, a bit more interested in preserving Jewish tradition than Reform Judaism. So they believe that while modernizing Judaism is good, that Judaism is dynamic, and that's why it has survived for all these centuries, it has to be done very gradually. You have to systematically analyze every change and really go through debate and discussion. That should be the guiding force in any reforms, rather than simply saying, oh, this is what people do here, let's try and adapt and assimilate to them, right? They felt that Reform Judaism had gone too far. So in conservative Judaism, most congregations will still use Hebrew in worship services. The belief is that the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, is still inspired by God. They're open to academic analysis of the text, but there's still this divine sanctity to revelation that in Reform Judaism, it's a bit more like this is sacred tradition rather than divine knowledge communicated in the sacred text. Initially, conservative Judaism rejected the ordination of women as rabbis, but in the years after Reform Judaism had started the practice, they too began to ordain women as rabbis in 1985. So in Reform Judaism in 1972, you had female rabbis. In conservative Judaism, that doesn't happen until 1985. So among the three core branches of modern Judaism, you now have female rabbis in Reform Judaism, female rabbis in conservative Judaism, but not in Orthodox Judaism. Okay? Like Reform Judaism, the United States of America is the center of conservative Judaism, but conservative is the smallest of these three branches. This is a Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City, or JTS for short. JTS is a place where people go to study Judaism and train to be rabbis and scholars, academic scholars of Judaism. And initially it was founded in order to create a kind of response to Reform Judaism. It was a defender of orthodoxy initially, but it evolved into the center of the conservative movement. So this seminary, JTS, is basically the headquarters, the intellectual center of conservative Judaism today. And where is it located? It's located here in the United States. It's in New York City. Right? And likewise, we have the preeminent institutions of Reform Judaism also here in the United States of America. So that's a nice segue for us to talk about Judaism in America, and then we'll get to Israel. As I said at the beginning of the first lecture on Judaism, the United States today has the second largest Jewish community in the entire world. It hasn't always been that way. If we went to the beginning of the 20th century, we would have found the largest community in the Russian Empire. But history of Judaism is full of these migrations to various parts of the world. So speaking today in the 21st century, we have approximately 5 million Jews in the United States of America. And as I explained in my first lecture as well, Jewish identity is complex. And the American Jewish community consists of those who are religiously observant, as well as those who identify as Jewish based on their culture, heritage, ancestry, rather than any commitment to religious beliefs or practices. So both of those types of being Jewish, that different ideas of Jewish identity, are present within the American Jewish community. American Jews are overwhelmingly of Ashkenazi origin. So if we were to do a study of the immigration of the ancestors of contemporary American Jews, we would find that the majority come from various parts of Europe, especially regions like Russia, Ukraine, Poland, various parts of Eastern Europe. But there are, of course, Sephardic Jews, Yemenites, Mizrahi Jews, all present in the United States as well, but the majority are of Ashkenazi origin. An interesting local fact is that although this is definitely not the case today, way back in the year 1800, the state of South Carolina had the largest Jewish population in the United States. Granted, it was small, but compared to anywhere else in the United States, it was the largest, and that community was centered around Charleston. And the time since then, that's dramatically changed. South Carolina does not have a particularly large Jewish community. Here in Myrtle Beach, I think there's 4 synagogues locally here. There's conservative, there's Reform, there's the Chabad, which is the Hasidic. There's even a Messianic community in Myrtle Beach. A Messianic being that they incorporate Christian theology into their beliefs. So they practice Christianity, they practice Judaism, but they believe that Jesus was the Messiah. And that for other Jews, they're not really Jews, but I'm not going to make that judgment. So we do have Jews here just within the Myrtle Beach area, and certainly in other parts of the state as well. American Jews have made enormous contributions to American culture, history, society. You can see in the image in the upper right-hand corner, the cover of Time magazine, and this is back from 1999, 2000. That's the presidential, vice presidential ticket for the Democratic Party in the 2000 election. The presidential nominee was Al Gore, and the vice presidential nominee was Senator Joseph Lieberman from Connecticut. And if they had won that election against George W. Bush, then Joseph Lieberman would have been the first Jewish vice president in American history. But the fact that he was a nominee alone, right, shows the prosperity of Jews here in the United States, which is not to say that we still don't grapple with anti-Semitism. That continues to be a problem here in the United States, but by and large, the story of American Jews has been one of relative safety and prosperity making important contributions to this country. In addition to JTS, which I already mentioned, Hebrew Union College is the preeminent institute for Reform Judaism. So if you want to become a Reform rabbi, that would be the place to go. The initial campus of Hebrew Union College was in Cincinnati in Ohio. And you might go, well, why was it over in Ohio? Well, back then in the late 19th century, that was sort of the Western frontier. And so land was much more accessible and available there for affordable prices. But there is a separate campus in New York City as well, which has probably succeeded the Cincinnati campus in prominence, but I could be wrong there. So once you get to 1948, we have the creation of a new Jewish state in the Middle East in what was previously the British Mandate of Palestine. And when that state was created, we see new waves of immigration from various parts of Europe, from the United States to this new state, the State of Israel. However, even after the creation of the State of Israel, the Jewish community here in the United States would remain large. And as I said, it's the second largest in the world. So here's a map showing the United States and the states with the largest Jewish population. So I see my home state of New York up here has one of the largest concentrations of American Jews. We've got New Jersey here as well. So the area in sort of the New York City metropolitan area has a very large Jewish community, and there are significant Jewish communities. I'm from upstate, from Rochester, and significant Jewish population up there as well. We can see some large numbers over here in the West Coast. We've got some in Florida, a lot of New Yorkers down here in Florida. But by and large, the northeastern United States, we really see the greatest concentration. Chicago, other big urban centers like that. And then we get really low numbers in the northern Midwest here, the Dakotas and Montana, Idaho and Wyoming and so forth, and then also down through this region. So a study was done to explore American Jewish identity and how American Jews thought about what it means to be Jewish, right? Jewish identity is complex in modern times. And the study is really interesting because what you see is that the older generations of American Jews tend to think of Jewish identity as something rooted in religion, in religious practice. But as you get younger, here we get to the millennial generation, those born after 1980, that number drops from 93% to 68%. 32% identifies that Jewish identity isn't, rooted in religion. And here you can see the results of a question about being Jewish is either mainly a matter of religion or ancestry and culture. And the overall was that Jewish identity for American Jews is primarily about ancestry and culture. 62% said that. Only 15% said it's based in religion. And then we have 23% saying it's a combination of the two. Right? So that gives you a sense of kind of the complexity of Jewish identity. If 62% are saying Jewish identity is primarily one of ancestry and culture, then whether or not you practice the religion of Judaism actually doesn't make a difference. Right? That's really interesting. Here's a denominational breakdown. So we learned about these three major branches of modern Judaism at the beginning of the lecture today: Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. For American Jews, 35% identify or belong to Reform Judaism. That's the biggest group. The second biggest group is the group that doesn't belong to any of them. 30%, no denomination. Then you have Conservative Judaism, the middle ground, at 18%, and then Orthodoxy at 10%. And there are other branches of modern Judaism that we just don't have time to get into, and there we have them in the 6% camp. So if we were to do a similar study of the State of Israel, the Orthodox branch would be the biggest, and Reform would shrink way down. But in America, the liberal branches predominate, the more conservative branches dominate in the State of Israel. So let's turn to the State of Israel now and learn about how that state came about and the thinking behind it. So in the modern era, once we see this transition from empires to new nation states, the idea of nationalism is sweeping the world. People are thinking about belonging to a people, a nation with a shared heritage, a shared culture, which may include religion, a shared language, and that they should have a state unto themselves. Now, as we know, in the diaspora period, you have Jews scattered throughout all these different countries. And in the modern era, we have these various efforts towards adapting and assimilating. And so people who are in France are speaking French and maybe thinking of themselves in terms of being French. Right? Yes, they're Jewish, but they're French. So for some, that was the future of being Jewish, right? Being part of these societies with France, America, whatever it may be. But others began to think of Jews as a distinctive people unto themselves, apart from everyone else, as a distinctive nation. And being a distinctive nation, they too should have their own state, just like there's a German state and a French state and a British state and an Irish state and so forth. The Jews, and think about the notion of Jewish identity as not just being religious, but also of an ethno-cultural identity as well, that the Jews should have their own state. This thinking, this type of Jewish nationalism, develops into a political ideology which is called Zionism. So Zionism, in the most basic sense, is this idea that Jews, no matter where they are in the world, are one people and a people who deserve their own state, a Jewish state, apart from everyone else. Right? And that state being ultimately, initially doesn't exist yet, but then being the state of Israel. So who came up with this idea? The founder of Zionism was a Hungarian Jewish journalist named Theodor Herzl. So Herzl was by and large a secular man, someone who was from a branch of the Ashkenazi Jewish community who had adapted and assimilated, had placed a lot of hope in the promise of modern nationalism and secularism. But anti-Semitism continued to persist. So he lives before the Holocaust, of course, but anti-Semitism is continuing to persist in a variety of ways. And there was a court case in France known as the Dreyfus Affair. France had emerged as this secular nation state which promised equality for all its citizens, regardless as to whether you were Catholic or Protestant or Jewish or non-religious. But there was a French military officer who was being put on trial and being accused of treason. Now, to the neutral outside observer, the evidence stated very clearly that this Jewish French military officer was innocent. But the court found him guilty. And the conclusion of many outside observers, including Theodor Herzl, this journalist reporting on the case, concluded that he was found guilty because he was Jewish, that he was being accused of being someone who was a traitor on the fact that he was Jewish, that he was innocent, in fact, but he was found guilty of this crime purely on the basis of anti-Semitic attitudes. So this has a big impact on Herzl. And so Herzl concludes that Jews in Europe don't have a future as vulnerable minorities, that if the Jewish community hopes to prosper and be safe, they will have to have, like other people at the time, their own state, where they can have their own government, where they can have their own army and be able to defend themselves. So they won't be vulnerable to non-Jewish authorities anymore. So he becomes the father of the movement known as Zionism. He writes a text called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, where he makes his case. So this, of course, is happening at a time in which empires are, in some cases, crumbling. New nation states are emerging. The British Empire is really still prospering at this time, and we know that they are colonizing different parts of the world. We talked about British colonial rule in India, for example, in my lecture on modern Hinduism and how Mahatma Gandhi worked to try and get the British to leave India, and India could be an independent state. And then that results in the partition, and we have Pakistan, a Muslim majority state, in India, a Hindu majority state. Well, the British, in addition to having India, they also control Palestine. So Palestine at this time had been part of the Ottoman Empire, a Muslim empire that had ruled Palestine since 1517. And before that, Palestine was under the rule of various other Muslim empires going all the way back to the 7th century. And Muslim forces conquered Palestine from the Byzantine Empire, which was the Eastern Roman Christian Empire. Well, Palestine by this time was inhabited, fully inhabited with towns and cities, of course, big cities like Jerusalem, that is a holy city to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. And Because it had now fallen under British rule, the Ottoman Empire fell apart in World War I, and the British would take over the land. Those who followed Zionism came to see an opportunity in this British colonial period for immigration to the British Mandate of Palestine and the creation of the state that Herzl had hoped to one day see emerge, a Jewish state with the Jewish government, Jewish military, in order to protect themselves. Of course, Palestine also had obvious significance to Jewish beliefs and traditions, right? This was the land of David's kingdom of Israel, subsequently the kingdom of Judah, the site of the holy temples and so forth. So it was an obvious choice as a place, a significant geographic site to build a future Jewish state. Well, initially, within the Jewish community in Europe, there were mixed opinions about the whole Zionist project. Orthodox traditional Jews opposed it, in part because the leaders of the Zionist movement were largely secular. They weren't religiously observant Jews. And so there was suspicion of them, but also some Orthodox rabbis believed that the diaspora would only end and the Jewish state would only be restored to the promised land once the Mashiach comes, once the Messiah comes. And so for these secular political activists to force God's hand by creating this state, that was something unacceptable, that they were deviating from the Torah and from Judaism and using Judaism as a basis for this modern secular political movement. All right. Here we see a photograph of Herzl. Now, Theodor Herzl died in 1904. The state of Israel comes into existence in 1948, so he never lived to see the creation of Israel. In fact, he didn't go to Palestine. He dies in Europe. Later on, his remains are moved to Israel once it's established. But here you can see the cover of the sort of the foundational text of Zionism, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. Now, Herzl, being a secularist, envisioned a future Jewish state being a secular state. He didn't see the Jewish state restoring the old Davidic monarchy and being a theocracy, where you have the laws of the Torah as the basis of the legal system, or an absolute monarchy from the house of David ruling. Instead, he saw it as an extension of European political systems. He envisioned the future state as a secular state for Jews that would use parliamentary democracy. And that's what Israel would become, a secular state, albeit one with a special relationship towards the religion of Judaism. And instead of a monarchy, it uses a parliamentary system with the prime minister. So before the state of Israel is created and the Zionist movement has picked up steam, various waves of immigrants have moved to the British Mandate of Palestine, creating conflict with the existing Arabic-speaking inhabitants who are both Muslim and Christian. There were some Palestinian Jews, but most of the inhabitants, the people that we know today as Palestinians, were Muslim or Christian. Back in Europe, we have the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, which I talked a little bit about in my fourth lecture when talking about the Ashkenazis. And of course, the Nazi Party is a openly, aggressively anti-Semitic movement that wants to eliminate Jews from Europe, right? This is a white supremacist political movement. And they set up death camps where they go and they arrest Jews throughout Europe, wherever they can find them, put them into these Nazi death camps, and then systematically murder them. And the result, of course, is the death of 6 million Jews, overwhelmingly Ashkenazi Jews. The Nazis do get into North Africa and do result in killing some Sephardic Jews as well. But the community that bears the brunt of the Nazi attacks and genocide is the Ashkenazi community. So this results in a reduction of 60% of Europe's Jewish population. 60%. So countries like Poland, which once had a very large Jewish community, it's almost entirely wiped out. Almost entirely wiped out. So in the face of the horrors of the Holocaust, the idea of Zionism, of Jews having their own state, gains more and more support. And so it's in the aftermath of the Second World War that we have the creation of the State of Israel officially in 1948. When Jewish immigrants, principally from Europe, start arriving in Palestine, and they buy land and often from absentee landowners, they arrive with the idea that we're going to create our own state here. But the indigenous inhabitants, the Arabic-speaking Muslims and Christians, say, well, wait, we already live here, and we want the British to leave so we can have our own state, a state of Palestine, just like there's now a state of Syria and Lebanon and Egypt and Iraq. We want our own state as well. So we have an outbreak of competing nationalisms. Arab nationalism, hoping to see the creation of a Palestinian state, and Jewish nationalism, Zionism, hoping to see the creation of a Jewish state in the same land. So we have the seeds of a very bitter conflict. The United Nations seeks to intervene. And what they do is they decide to partition Palestine into two separate states, a Jewish state of Israel and a Palestinian state, existing side by side. But the Palestinians reject the plan. And it makes sense because at that time, the number of Arabs compared to the number of Jews in the region, it was overwhelmingly still Arab. And so the idea that this land should be given 50% to these European immigrants and only 50% to the indigenous inhabitants was incredibly problematic for them. This breaks out into full-scale war. From the Israeli side, this is the Great War of Independence, the birth of their country. For the Palestinians, the Arabs, who had on their side neighboring Arab states like Syria and Egypt, this was a disaster. And they call it the Nakba, which means the catastrophe. This is where they lost their country and lost their homes. As a result of the Israeli victory, 700,000 Arab refugees, Muslim and Christian, are now without their homes. They lose their villages, they lose their cities, and even today in the 21st century, this situation has not been resolved, and we still have original refugees, but their descendants as well, which are far more numerous, still living in refugee camps in various parts of the world. And so the Israeli-Palestinian conflict still remains an incredibly bitter, intense, emotional conflict that can be dangerous to even talk about in some circumstances. Here we can see the cover of the British-era Palestine Post newspaper that announces the state of Israel is born. The original Zionists were overwhelmingly Ashkenazi Jews, but the outbreak of the Israeli-Palestinian or initially Israeli-Arab conflict has a dramatic impact on Sephardic Jews, the Jews who are living in Arab states like Egypt, because suddenly they start getting treated like enemies within. Right? They're treated as if, oh, you're sympathetic to the Zionists. You're part of the colonial project trying to take Arab land. And so we begin to see the outbreak of persecution of Sephardic Jews in countries like Morocco, Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia. And so then you begin to see waves of Sephardic Jews to Israel as well. And in Israel today, the number of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews actually outnumbers the Ashkenazi Jews, whereas initially it was much more Ashkenazi in the formation of the state, but subsequently the Sephardic, Mizrahi, Yemenite, even Ethiopian Jews now outnumber the European Jews in the state of Israel. This series of maps shows the territorial movements in the birth of the state of Israel. So this map shows the British Mandate of Palestine here and the territories that are inhabited by the Arab Palestinians, either Muslim or Christian, and the Jews. The orange territory are the Jewish communities. The yellow is the Arab. Okay, so it's overwhelmingly Palestinian or Arab. Then you have the partition plan by the United Nations, right? That the only way to solve this conflict, this problem, is to divide it into two states so both people can have their own state. The orange is going to be the Israeli state. The yellow is going to be the Palestinian state. And then Jerusalem, the holy city, according to the United Nations, was going to be a multinational zone, sort of like the United Nations itself. And there would be various parties who oversaw the administration of the holy city, that it shouldn't belong to either group, that it should be a kind of autonomous, independent entity separate from the two states. But as I said, the Palestinians reject the partition plan, war results, and the Israelis, and they're not the Israelis yet, but the Zionist forces succeed in winning, and they take not only the land that was partitioned to them, but even more. And so here you can see all the territory in orange now becomes Israel. And when in 1948, the new state of Israel is recognized, this is what it looks like. So for the international community, the state of Israel looks like this. This is the official state of Israel. Now, you see that there's some remaining lands here, and they're not in yellow anymore, because this part of Palestine is taken by the Jordanians during the war. This part is taken by the Egyptians. And so the Palestinians are now living under other Arab regimes and rulers. In 1967, another war breaks out between Israel, which now is a state, a secular state for the Jews. It's not a monarchy, it's not a theocracy, it's a secular European-style state, against its Arab neighbors again. This is called the Six-Day War, because in the span of 6 days, the Israelis succeed in defeating the Egyptians and the Syrians. With the success of the Israeli military, they take more territory. So the Israelis take the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. They also take Gaza from Egypt. And they take the West Bank, which included East Jerusalem, which is the part of Jerusalem that is the old city, the holy park, with all the sacred sites in it, from the Jordanians. And they also take a part of Syria called the Golan Heights. So suddenly, Israel's territory vastly expands. But there's a problem there. According to international law, the United Nations, you can't annex territory that you conquered in war. So, for example, when the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, it would be a violation of international law for the United States to have then declared Iraq to be part of the United States. That's a violation. So the continued, as it's called, the Israeli occupation of these territories has remained problematic. The Israeli government claims that territory as theirs, but according to international law and the international community, this is occupied land. Now, Sinai would be given back to the Egyptians with a peace treaty with Anwar Sadat, president of Egypt. So Sinai goes back to Egypt. But then these three areas remain what's called the occupied territories. This land, still part of Syria, but it's controlled, and actually the current government has annexed the Golan Heights. And then this land is what people call the occupied territories or occupied Palestine. All the while, the Palestinians still don't have a state, which means that they don't have the rights of citizenship or anywhere. They live under military rule. So when there's a crime or something like that, over time there would develop these sort of local Palestinian courts, but the real authority is the Israeli government and the Israeli military in the territories. And so you continue to have this ongoing conflict without peace. So the significance religiously for the victory of the Israelis in the 1967 Six-Day War is that the holy sites become part of Israel. And that includes the holiest site in modern Judaism, which is the Western Wall, also called the Wailing Wall. Oh, geez, I went over my time. I'm sorry, I didn't realize it was 11:52. All right, so you have a homework assignment that is due by the start of class on Monday. Feel free to go through the rest of these slides. Have a great weekend, and I will see you on Monday.